finished conversations, sort of important conversations. And that's part of why you're here, important conversations, but a part of why you're here is also to listen to Russ this evening and to share his wisdom and experience. Before I do that, given the spirit of truth and reconciliation that permeates a lot of Russ's work, and there's a need for us to acknowledge that we live on the land of Mi'kmaq, an ancient land full of mystery and wonder and things that we have not had exposure to, that we need to spend time on. And hopefully through tonight, through the understanding of truth and reconciliation, we will have a chance to do that. And in doing that, become richer people for it. Richer spiritually, richer culturally, richer as human beings. Because indeed, that's what the process of truth and reconciliation is about. As hard as it is, as difficult and as challenging as it is, it delivers us to a place of greater and deeper humanity and greater and deeper connection. This evening, these are the Aitken lectures, and given in memory of Ed Aitken, former president of AST, a great preacher, a great communicator, a man passionate with the gospel and put it at the forefront of his life. We're honored this year to have as our Aitken scholar, the Reverend Dr. Russ Daye. Many of you know him, many of you are here because you know Russ Daye. So Russ has a PhD from Concordia University in comparative religion. He's made truth and reconciliation a focus in his academic work, but also in his life and in his teaching. That's enough of an introduction because the night should belong to his topic and to our lecturer and guest scholar this night, who's a friend to all of us. So Russ, we are in your hands. Thank you. Okay.
Well, good evening. It's good to be here. And I hope by the end of the evening you feel the same way. I look around and most of the people who are here, whom I know, are Christian. And this is a Christian theological college. But I want to say that we're here to talk about truth-telling and wisdom, and we are very happy to have friends from other faiths, and we're very happy to hear dialogue and Q&A at the end from other faith perspectives. So if you are of the Jewish community, shalom. I doubt we have any Muslims here on this evening, because I think they're about to have a big party. But if any are here, we greet you with Assalamu alaikum. Any folks of the Hindu faith, we greet you with a namaste. And if there are any of our Mi'kmaq friends here who say, well, thank you for being with us and thank you for having us on your land. The title for this talk tonight is Truth-Telling in a Post-Everything World, Daring. As I was writing this and preparing it, I wanted to switch to another title, which was Lessons Learned by an Intermittent Apostate. But then, I've been telling my post-everything preaching class, don't use words like apostate because they come from Christendom. So we'll stay with the original title. What do I mean by a post-everything world? Well, let's talk about some of the posts that are shaping our world to get started. First one is postmodernism. And I'm sure that you all have heard lots about postmodernism, sometimes go by quickly and sometimes even in a facile fashion. But I just want to point out a few characteristics of postmodernism as we start to contextualize and talk about daring. One of the characteristics of postmodernism is skepticism. And you see in the art that has arisen in the postmodern era, the skepticism around previous forms built right into the art. But what are postmoderns skeptical about? Well, one thing is absolute truth. There is a deep and growing suspicion that began in academia, first European academia with writers like Lyotard, who confronted the Western assumption that there are absolute truths out there in the universe to be discovered. And in its strongest expressions, postmodernism asserts that truth is not discovered at all, it is generated. That truth is a human creation, not something discovered by us. Now, something akin to that is a suspicion about grand narratives. Sometimes postmoderns call these meta-narratives. One story that is meant to cover all life and to explain or give meaning to everybody in all places and all times. Now, communism attempted to articulate a meta-narrative, a class struggle that would end in the dictatorship of the proletariat and the ushering in of a just and egalitarian society. And Marx and Engels argued that this was built into the fabric of human society and human economy and was inevitable. What's the meta-narrative that most of us here are familiar with? The Christian meta-narrative. Right? For 2 millennia, we have claimed that the story of Christ and Christ's Father, God, and the Spirit explains everything from the creation of the universe to what will happen at the end of time, to what's good and bad in this period, to what appropriate gender roles are, etc., etc., etc. Another thing that postmoderns are suspicious of is progress. There has been, especially in Western society, a confidence for a number of centuries that if we just keep working hard, we will build the world as it should be. That genius and cooperation and elbow grease will improve the world. We can make it a better place, fundamentally. And at its heart, postmodernism is suspicious of that belief. What is the most widely read mainline Protestant magazine publication in the United States? The Christian Century. Yeah, and Christianity Today has sort of got at least one foot in the evangelical camp. The Christian Century was to be what? The 20th century was supposed to be the century when Christians made the world as it was supposed to be. The Christian century was a whole idea that divine agency would be transferred to human agency and that we would go out and build the world as it was supposed to be. And we launched ourselves into the 20th century with a confidence that we Christians carried the truth and we were going to make the world as God wanted it to be. And that first great confrontation with that folly took the form of the First World War. Colonialism was built in some ways on that initiative. Residential schools were built on that initiative. Another thing that postmoderns are suspicious of is rationality. In the Kirk-Spock debate, the postmoderns take Kirk's side. There has been within modernity a deep faith in reason, going all the way back to the Enlightenment, and a sense that we can think our way We can analyze our way. We can use linear sequential thinking to fundamentally understand the world and build a better one. Postmodernism is suspicious of that faith. Now, there are some people who give fairly articulate, optimistic articulations in relation to postmodernism. I have stolen this slide from the Edge Network, which is a network, this next slide, a network of coaches and consultants that were put together by the United Church of Canada to help faith communities transform and renew. So, I'll read this for you because the font's pretty small. These are the characteristics of the modern era. See that architecture? Mechanistic, analytical, rational, top-down, text-based. You get a sense? Assembly lines. Hierarchical organization. Texts. Postmodern, organic fluid, so now biological analogies and metaphors ascending over mechanistic ones. Experiential, mystical, communal, and TGIF. Thank God it's Friday. Why is that in there? Because, at least in this articulation, postmoderns are not, they don't like Scott Peck. They're not willing to defer gratification. They want to do the work and have a good time doing it. Notice, it was a real aspect of modernism, was gird yourselves and defer your gratification until the work is done. Postmoderns, we're going to have fun along the way. We're going to take our coffee into the sanctuary. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next post, which is post-literary. Anybody know this fellow? This is Marshall McLuhan. And Marshall McLuhan's most famous slogan or utterance was? The cacophony of voices who went first got it right. The medium is the message. All media, in and of themselves, regardless of the messages they communicate, exert compelling influence on us as individuals and society. So, one of the things we have to understand about McLuhan's work and his assertion that we're in a post-literary culture is that the content of media is of secondary importance. It doesn't matter what you're watching on TV, and what you're watching on TV, and what you're watching on TV, and you're watching on TV for our culture nearly as much as the fact that millions of us are plugged into the boob tube every evening. Or, to update his description to the current age, it doesn't matter what you're reading on Facebook, Bob, and it doesn't matter what you're reading on Instagram, Rob, and it doesn't matter what the contents of your texts are, Helen, and it doesn't matter, David, no, you're the wrong example. The content of any of that stuff going by is not nearly as important as the fact that so many of us are plugged in to this so much of the time. And what's happening is our brains are being restructured. And our culture is being transformed by the fact that we have transitioned from spending so much time with a black and white page in front of us, reading, to long discursive texts, to being in media where you have these short little texts go by, short little quanta of messaging, interspersed with image and sound and color. Now, McLuhan's assertion was that Prehistoric people lived in a harmonious balance of the senses. This is really important to understand. To understand his work and work of those like him. That in pre-literate, prehistoric tribal cultures, we fully inhabited our bodies. Right? This is why people in tribal cultures tend to dance so much better than most other y'all. And one of the really interesting things for me is I have a son who dances really well. He's like fluid. And his hips don't squeak when he dances. He spent his first 3 years of life in a village setting in Fiji. It's amazing how much that has altered his body in relation, especially compared to his old man. I remember putting a little kind of dance thing in a sermon one time, and he was sitting in the second seat, and he just spent the whole time like this. And I'm talking like 7 seconds of imitation of Cam Newton or somebody. So there's a harmonious balance, and the ways that tribal peoples in pre-literate times communicated engaged the ear, and the ear in some way is connected to the whole body. The vibration goes through the whole body when you're the one beside the drum, or hitting the drum that's going ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. Subsequent technological innovations alter this balance. And they change our bodies, and they change our minds, our neural network. And the biggest one is what he called the Gutenberg galaxy. With the advent of the printing press and the great expansion of literacy rates, print culture caused the visual to ascend over the oral. So now we're engaging text with our eyes, right? When we sit down to read, we shut down most of our senses and most of our body. Huh? We also have to make a series of guesses about what those things on the page mean. Even if we're reading a Harlequin romance novel, we still have to use analytical, rational thought to guess what that configuration of letters on the page means. And so you're moving into a brain functioning that highly values the analytical and sequential. And because reading requires constant decision-making and interpretation, those who engage in it tend towards the analytical, sequential, linear, and logical. Can it be a coincidence that the advent of printing culture and the expansion of Protestant religion, with its focus on Paul's epistles, notice, books that make propositional assertions as opposed to offering narratives, and propositional three-point preaching had their origins in Northern Europe at the same time? The whole move into Protestantism, which was in some ways a precursor of capitalism and a market economy organized along analytical sequential principles, and the Enlightenment required a shift into the mental state, the common mental state that McLuhan calls the Gutenberg galaxy. Now this can be overstated, but I think the convergence of these things is not by coincidence. So let's just do a sidebar for a second and talk about the Gutenberg galaxy and preaching. Because preaching is a good example of how Christians like to make truth claims. So, following the invention of the printing press, there is a movement away from the participation mystique of Roman Catholic Mass and the narrative shaping of the world in oral cultures towards doctrinal assertions embedded in rhetoric, For example, the 3-point sermon. So how does preaching happen in oral cultures dominated by the ear? There's a primary use of stories. The key skill is stitching stories together. Repetition, for the purposes of memory, is really important in oral cultures. Preaching in oral cultures begins with a story, not an idea. There's often a tone of conflict, and it tends to be right-brain holistic. What happens with preaching in literate cultures? Anybody know who that guy is? Are your eyes really good, or can you recognize the picture? Which was it? Were your eyes really good, or did you recognize it?
My eyes are just good.
Okay. Paul Teller. There's a shift to the primary use of ideas. Sermon structure is a linear development of ideas. We use outlines. Propositions are the main points as opposed to stories. They're analytical, left brain in nature, and they require thinking and idea. Now, let's take a pause here. I'm looking out at the demographic that was showed up this evening. And there may be a couple of exceptions, but most of us were shaped in that world, right? We grew up in the literate culture. And as McLuhan would say, we just assumed that that air which we breathed was the only air to breathe. That sea in which we swam was the only sea in which to swim. Turns out, it wasn't so. And what McLuhan predicted with amazing insight, even before the advent of the internet, was a reversal of the move into the Gutenberg galaxy. And now we see a move into what he calls a retribalization. Now, I love this quote. These new media of ours have made our world into a single unit. The world is now like a continually sounding tribal drum. Boom, boom, boom. Where everybody gets the message all at the same time. A princess gets married in England, and boom, boom, boom go the drums. And we all hear about it. An earthquake in North Africa, a Hollywood star gets drunk, away go the drums again. I use the word tribal, it's probably the key word. And we've just seen so many examples of this. Did you see what happened to the global GLTBQ community in the wake of Orlando? Right? And frankly, before retribalization, the phrase the global GLTBQ community would have been impossible to utter. Because you wouldn't have had a global community. And secondly, the move into postmodernism and post-literate society and the breaking down of dominant meta-narrative was probably a prerequisite for the emergence of this GLTBQ community I'm talking about. It's amazing to see the things that just go viral on Facebook or on the internet or on YouTube, and the impact it has on us. McLuhan says electric technologies collapse space to a point, effectively recreating the continuous ambient oral awareness of the tribe. Although, there's something different about retribalization than there was with tribalization. And that is choice. If you were born Iroquois 200 years ago, or 500 years ago, you were going to be Iroquois. That was your tribe. If you were born into the Gaelic-speaking Scottish Protestant community around the Bredor Lakes, that was going to be your tribe. Now you choose your tribe. You choose if you're going to be part of a GLTBQ tribe. And then you make choices on your Facebook friends and your Instagram accounts and where you go on YouTube, etc., etc. And you can fully immerse yourself into a tribal world and not have to be confronted by the truths of any of the other tribes, which may be coexisting in time, but are not coexisting in space. In this kind of space. Or you can be part of a neo-Pentecostal postmodern tribe and work on the rebirth of Christianity in that moment and connect to people all over the world who are doing that. All right, I'm going to move through some of these slides. In terms of how we make truth claims then, McLuhan would warn us about making truth claims in long discursive texts and even in propositional assertions if we want to be heard by the people inhabiting the world that's replacing the one that we grew up
Tell me what truth is. Is it a perception or a fact?
in. Is truth a perception or a fact? Actually, this entire evening is partially geared towards answering that question. So let me keep moving here, and I'm going to get to some of that, hopefully, by the end. I want to go very quickly past another post. I hope some of you know this wonderful young person who is our colleague at St. Andrew's United Church, Caitlin. And she inhabits what I am seeing a real expansion of, which is a post-gendered world. I was talking to my boys the other day, and they were talking about somebody who plays in both in a girl band and a boy band. And I said, well, how can this same person play in a girl band and a boy band? And my 13-year-old goes, oh, gender fluidity, Dad. Like, as though you were speaking to a pterodactyl, you know? Now, one form of post that I think is really important for most of us here tonight, and that we really have to confront if we're going to make truth claims, is post-Christian. We all know this, right? And we all know this right here. Huh? And those of us who are in leadership in churches in this time, we know it in the tension in our jaws, and in the acid in our bellies, and in the holding in our spine, and in the stiffness in our neck. We've been wrestling against this for a long time. What does it mean, post-Christianity? These are the words of Lauren Mead. We are at the front edges of the greatest transformation of the church that has occurred for 1,600 years. It is by far the greatest change that the church has ever experienced in North America. It may eventually make the transformation of the Reformation look like a ripple in a pond. And of course, we can quantify it. Started in the year I was born, 1962. So when the United Church people look at this slide, we find comfort in this slide. And in this slide. What's post-Christian? I think we now can say it is a very long deconstruction of this. See that snake eye? This is an official portrait of Pope Nicholas V. He's looking out on the world, and he's saying, I am looking at you. I own you. He's wearing headgear that replicates the architecture of cathedrals. He's wearing, embedded in the headgear, the riches of the nations in gold and jewels from all over the world. Nicholas V, I think, was the apotheosis of Christendom. And the reason why I say he was the apotheosis of Christendom was that he was the first pope to articulate papal bulls that outlined the doctrine of discovery. Dum diversitas, spelled D-U-M, should have been spelled D-U-M-B. This is what these papal bulls articulate. If Christian monarchs send their armies, their people, into the world, and they encounter nations inhabited by non-Christians, they are discovering those nations because they are not held by real people. And those Homo sapiens who are on the land can be killed or driven into slavery in service of the expansion of Christian nations because they don't count. And what's happened the world over as a result is this. This is an American piece of art that depicts the Trail of Tears. Trails of Tears in the U.S., most of them, or many of them, headed for Oklahoma. So the Seminoles all the way down in the bottom of Florida were forced off the land into Indian territory in Oklahoma. And the Navajo all the way out in Arizona and New Mexico were forced towards Oklahoma. And down further south in Texas, First Nations were forced. We had our own versions. Davis Inlet was a version. At the apotheosis of Christendom, what you had was the imposition of a meta-narrative on the world with hierarchical and absolute power, which turned out to be an exact contradiction of the gospel. And if we are going to ever be in a position to make truth claims again, we have to come to terms with that fact. That Christendom, at its height, became a perfect antithesis to the teachings of Christ. And the slide into post-Christendom, or what my theology prof, Douglas John Hall, called the humiliation of the church, has just been a long, slow overthrowing of that apostasy. I used that word twice. Apostasy is a betrayal of the faith. Usually we think of apostasy as leaving Christianity to become a Muslim or an atheist. I think that the greatest apostasy was the Christian dominant meta-narrative that reached its height with Nicholas V, but which we still see in lots of instances, and it was very much embedded in North American culture, ready to come alive again at 9/11, wasn't it? And even though it may have been hidden, it was very alive in the cabinet, and especially the Prime Minister's office of the previous Canadian government. So it's not all overthrown yet. Okay. So that's been the array of posts that add up to make a post-everything world. And I want to make a turn at this point. By the way, post doesn't mean it's all over. Postmodernism is sometimes just called late modernism. Post-literate doesn't mean we can't read. It's after, in some ways, but it's still very much engaged in. So, in order to get to a place of talking about truth-telling in a post-everything world, I want to leave it. And I want to move into some testimony and some storytelling and some narrative, which I actually think is an appropriate form of communication in a post-everything world. So I want to tell you about how I spent October and May. I spent October and May in the Middle East, a little bit in Turkey, mostly in Lebanon, and sort of dancing around the Syrian border, first on the east of Lebanon, and then in the north of Lebanon. Basically, I was exploring the refugee crisis. But as a byproduct of this, I had my first immediate, deep, visceral experience of Middle East Christianity, actually Middle East religion in general. I'd spent some time in Israel in the 80s. And what I discovered is it ain't post-Christian there. It's not post-literate. It's not post-colonial. It's Middle Eastern cultures are still very much embedded in meta-narratives. But they're competitive meta-narratives. And that's why so many people are getting killed, or one of the reasons. So I met a lot of people who look like this guy. He's the Armenian Catholicos. Doesn't mean he's Catholic. It's like an Orthodox bishop or patriarch. Does this fellow look post-Christian to you? Does he look post-literate? He's charming, but he's not post much. And then if you move from the Armenian church to the Syriac church, you get a fellow who looks like this. I've learned over the years, when you come across men in dresses, it's not post. Same in Fiji, where I lived for a time. And it may be pre, but it ain't post. And then this is a Sunni Muslim cleric. He's actually at the nearest school of theology, a Christian college, when I took this picture in Beirut, engaging in interfaith dialogue, which is a much more dangerous and much less common venture there than here. His name is Sher Mohammed Abu Zayd. He was very gracious. I had a short conversation with him. He was, in some ways, an exception to the rule. But he's not post. And neither are the Shia clerics who might engage there. And one of the most fascinating things I did when I was there is I went to a Shia Ashura service. Ashura is the remembrance of the martyrdom of Ali and Hussein and all of the Shia martyrs through the centuries. And they have a whole week of evening worship services and gatherings. And they come together I went to this mosque in a Shia suburb of Beirut, not too far from where the big triple suicide bombing happened in November, just 2 or 3 weeks after I left. A Shia suburb called Zuhaq al-Blat. They had to move through 3 lines of security to get into the mosque. And all these baby-faced young men carrying Kalashnikovs. And as you get closer to the mosque, the more cartridges they have around them. Why is that? Partially because competitive meta-narratives. Right? Assertion of our truth, even to the point of violence. These guys weren't going to be violent. They were going to try to stop the ISIS suicide bomber who would target them for a very physical assertion of a meta-narrative. And so I was there because also in sort of interfaith dialogue, on the Tuesday evening of the week that ends on the big Assure celebrations on Saturday, a number of Christians were invited to come and sit as witnesses. So let's say you're the mosque. This is what you would see on my right. All women, all head covered, all in black. On the left, all men, all in black. Up as we enter in the pulpit, which is up here, remember, assertion of meta-narrative, up here. And the 8 Christian witnesses were put in chairs. And we sat listening to this preaching, and it was all in Arabic. And I had somebody leaning over translating sometimes, but I asked him to stop because the more I understood what was being said, the more afraid I was. And it would be, a really dramatic narrative. And then you would hear the phrase, the great Satan in the Black House, or Israel, or Europe, or the US. And I was checking to make sure I had the Canadian passport in my back pocket. And folks are getting worked up more and more. And then they break not into violence, but into communal grieving. They just start weeping. They just start weeping. And that happened a couple times throughout the evening. And then, when the evening ended, we were ushered out and we had to walk out amongst the 500 people gathered, now all standing. And I'm thinking, walking out, holy smokes. And so every guy whose eyes I meet, because I'm not meeting women's eyes, because they're averting their eyes. Every guy whose eyes I meet, I'm mouthing Assalamu alaikum and then putting my hand to my heart, which is a Middle Eastern gesture. Now, I get near the back of the room, and this guy who spoke good English comes up to me. I know you a little better, so I'm going to do this to you and not to him. He comes up to me, and he grabs me by the lapels, and he says, "What did you think?" And I said, "I didn't understand a whole lot of what was being said, but I understand that your people feel tremendous grief and loss and have done for millennia." And he grabbed me by the face, and he picked me up, and he kissed me on the forehead, and then he put me down, and as we were ushered out of the room, all of us were handed food and drink as an act of hospitality. I couldn't quite bring myself to kiss you on the forehead, Jody. I know you would have been fine with it. Now, I tell that story because there was something in that encounter about a turn from the violent assertion of meta-narratives in the modern era, in pre-modern era, to some kind of truth-telling. Testimony, reflecting back. And it was a very powerful exchange for me. The reason we were not showing up on Saturday is because in some of the assurance celebrations at the end of the week in Beirut and other Shia places, this is what happens. They're cutting themselves as acts of grief, of making visceral what their community feels as a whole. This isn't post. Huh? One of the things people said about post-Christian is, when you're really post-Christian is when the larger society has stopped loathing you and just started not caring about you. This is not caring. Okay? The great tragedies about the competitive assertion of meta-narratives is what we've all been witnessing on the news for so long. Baghdad 2 days ago. Istanbul last week. Beirut in November. Little village on the Lebanon, Syria border that I've come very close to just a couple of weeks ago. And as you move through the Middle East, you just keep coming across images like this. This is in Turkey, in Izmir, a city not far from where little Alin and his family tried to cross the Mediterranean. These are refugees cramming the streets, waiting for their opportunity to take those boats and risk their lives. And these are some of the images that I came across on the Lebanon-Syria border. This blue tarp structure is the first refugee camp in a refugee camp that I entered last October and met this family. The father is wounded from the escape from Syria. The daughter in the middle was 11 and was suffering from a heart valve problem and needed to come somewhere where she could get help. People are sick and broken all over the place. The refugee family that has come to St. Andrews has a baby with cancer in both eyes. And these stories are legion. The embodiment of stress is just so legion. Her 12-year-old sister was married to a 40-year-old Lebanese man because he had the wherewithal to get out of the country and to make that dangerous journey across the Mediterranean and then to walk all the way to Germany where they are now in refugee camps, hoping to bring the rest of the family. Imagine making those choices. 12-year-old married to a 40-year-old. Some of the kids, some of the conditions in some of the worst camps. This is a camp on the northern border. St. Andrews has developed a partnership with a Presbyterian church right there to open a school and medical clinic for the people of this refugee camp and some others beside it. I find this really heartbreaking. If you know the Middle East, you know that people want to have at least one what planted in the middle of their property. Olive tree. Olive is king of the table. It's tremendously important. Look at what's in the bucket. Then there are the refugees in the cities. The majority of refugees in Lebanon aren't in camps. This is in a place called Borshamud, where Armenian refugees flooded have crammed that city. This is the Near East School of Theology.
I'm sorry, but the guy in the back with Logos, my church helped sponsor him and he's in Toronto now. In the striped shirt.
Are you from Deer Park? Or are you
I'm with Columba, we partnered with Deer Park and
So,
he's here, he's in Toronto and I met him.
yeah, Bohos has become a close friend of mine. He cooked me dinner 2 weeks ago, and somewhere in Canada found a rack and gave me, it's like Lebanese ouzo. Gave me
So
some
when you
rack.
said Near East, I'm like, I wonder if he knows Logos.
Bohos is my buddy. Matter of fact, I talked to him this morning. I bought him a plane ticket so he can come to Berwick Camp and immerse. He's a refugee who's just come to Canada from the Near East School of Theology. Freaking Bohos, everywhere I go. I love Bohos.
You just listen to him speak and you can listen for hours.
But I'm going to tell this story. He's going to love this. Anyway, he's coming to Berwick to be there with Marie and to learn about right relations in Canada and just be a Christian community this summer. Anyway, I spent some time there. Place Near East School of Theology is AST saturated with refugees. Imagine that 60 or 80 Syrian refugees pile into this place so that it could be safe whilst they studied at St. Mary's, at Daye, at the Mount, at AST. And the community is totally shaped by these refugees. Everybody in this picture, except for the woman to Bohos' right, who's a German, is Syrian. I'm going to tell you a little story about an evening I spent there. They play volleyball every Thursday evening in the bowels of this 8-story theological college, 2 stories underground. And I played volleyball with them. It's pretty competitive. So afterwards, I was too wound up to go to sleep, and didn't have my bottle of Iraq handy to help. So I went into the TV lounge, and I was watching a Champions League game. It was Paris Saint-Germain against Real Madrid. And we're watching this game, and while we're watching the game, these 2 Syrian guys, not bohos, are watching YouTube videos on their iPad. And they turn to this YouTube video, which is a picture of a Russian helicopter gunship fighting ISIS fighters in the village near Aleppo where they live. They're getting their news. Again, boom, 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 retribalization. They're getting their news from video shot by ISIS fighters who would be putting them in orange jumpsuits and cutting their heads off if they were there. And they're just watching it in the same way that I'm watching the soccer game. And I couldn't take it. And all these images of what I had just showed you and hundreds of other pictures I had seen just came alive inside of me. And as the ISIS fighters are shouting, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. God is great, God is great. I couldn't take it. And I left the room. As I'm walking up the stairs, I hear myself saying out loud in the resonance of the stairs in this theological college, God is silent. I didn't know it, but I was joining the cacophony of Jewish voices from the 40s who claimed God is silent. And for me, at that moment, all narrative and all capacity to truth tell fell away. And I could truth tell by relating my experiences. But I had no capacity to make truth claims or to make assertions about what is and what isn't, what's good and what's bad, what's righteous and what's unrighteous, what we should do or shouldn't do. I lost my voice, my agency. And on my last day in Lebanon in the fall, I came across this sculpture outside a 900-year-old Maronite church in Byblos. And what's compelling about this is that Christ, it doesn't depict the cross, but it depicts Christ with his arms nailed behind his back, and he's leaning forward with these great spikes. And because he's leaning forward, his chest cavity is collapsed, and he might be able to utter a moan, but there's no words coming out. And that's the God that I encountered. A God with no agency, whose arms have been nailed behind his back by competitive meta-narratives asserted in his name, and it is his over there, and who's been silenced by the cries, Allahu Akbar. Then I come to Canada and find that God's being silenced in other ways. If you were to survey the depiction of religion and clergy in our media in recent years, you would find an active silencing of God and those who would claim to speak on God's behalf. This is the single minister in the HBO series. I picked the HBO series just as a sample. Daye. In some ways, he's an empathetic character, but all of his religious visions are the product of a lesion in his brain, which is killing him, like the church is doing. And then if you go to the HBO series Carnival, the clergyman is Brother Justin. Does he look like a nice guy? And when he's unmasked and his true nature is revealed, this is what you get. And then, if you survey the depiction of faith and religion in movies, you get, remember that one? The central question of this, well, there's two central questions. Can you have faith? And it's played out in dialogue with what question? Is he a pedophile? And then, of course, but I think that this is the best image to represent the state of mainline, anyway, religion in our culture, and the silencing of God. Because what you got is the embodiment, notice his eye, Nicholas V. You have the move from the creepy to the ridiculous, or the embodiment of, at the same time, the predating and the innate. Huh? Those of us who've worked as religious professionals for a while in our culture know that there's not an abrupt silencing of God through the shouts, Allahu Akbar. It's almost like the frog in the kettle analogy. Huh? The slow, quiet smothering of faith and the capacity to make truth claims from a point of view of faith. And so, we land in the same place. Now, I want to tell you about a woman who gave me back my voice and my capacity to make truth claims in this place or in the Middle East. And who I think can teach us how to make truth claims. And her name is Ruth. So I'm going to do something that I shouldn't do in post everything context. Is not tell the story of Ruth. Unless, is there anybody here who needs me to fill in the rudimentary details of the story of Ruth? You all good? Okay. This is an Arab woman from Moab who finds herself stranded with her mother-in-law, who's fled from Israel in a famine. And they've lost all the men in their lives, which means they have no agency. They're completely vulnerable. And they have to go on a refugee journey. Actually, they don't. Naomi does. On a refugee journey from Moab, bending around the Dead Sea back to Israel. But she tells her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Naomi, go home, go to your people. And, Orpah and Ruth, and Naomi says to them, go to your people. And Ruth says that famous saying, wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. My God will be your God. What we don't know, until later in the story, is that by making Naomi's God her God, Ruth gave God agency in that story. Until that point, God's silent. At best, when they land in her hometown, Naomi says to the people, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Don't call me sweetness, which is what Naomi means. Call me bitterness. And she identifies God as the one who made her bitter. So God is either highly problematic or just silent in this story, until Ruth, by making the choice to accompany a Jewish refugee on the refugee journey through all the perils of journeying alone as women. They would have been there in those days, the same that they are today. She accompanies her back to Israel, and she gives God agency in the story. She gives God voice in the story. Now, the question that's being asked throughout the story over and over again is who's going to have access to Ruth's body? Right? And that's actually how they achieve agency and are saved, is they pick Boaz. They pick a guy who should never have access to an Arab woman's body as the guy who's going to have access. And their claiming of agency, of power over the choice of who has access to Ruth's body is what saves her. But it also completes the circle of love. Until that point, Ruth has given God agency in the story through the embodiment of philios and agape, sisterly love and unconditional, self-sacrificing love in relation to this Jewish woman. The circle of love is completed with arrows on the threshing floor when she seduces Boaz. And all of them together step into a new reality marked by God. And then a son is produced. And is it the son of the son or the son of the son of the son who ends up being the king of Israel? Right? You notice what she did? She called God out of the silence. Almost like reality in a quantum universe, God existed only as potential in that story until somebody exerted agency that called God out of potential and into reality. By claiming agency, she gave God agency. Sounds like theoretical physics to me. And then what happened when I was touched by this story is I realized I'd met Ruth over and over again in the Middle East. This is a man named Bashara Musa Ogli. Should be called Ruth. He is a Protestant minister in Aleppo. You all know what's happening in Aleppo right now? I met him when he came out of Aleppo with a daughter to take her to Nest to study. And we traveled for a week together around the Syria-Lebanon borders, visiting refugee camps. We were in one camp. It was 5 kilometers from Syria and literally 10 kilometers from ISIS. And we were told that they heard the fighting every night. And we're sitting in one of the tents that I showed you, and we hear all this small weapons fire, and I thought, okay, it's all over, right? Where's the poison pill? And he starts laughing at me. You know, he says, it's just a wedding, Russ. I kind of followed him around Lebanon for a week like a puppy dog, picking up grains of wisdom behind him. And then he got back on a bus, a taxi, took the perilous journey across the desert to Aleppo, risking capture, went back into a city at war. In the meantime, his house has been hit twice by rocket shells. One of them flew into his daughter's bedroom when she was sleeping and sat there unexploded. And he goes back to minister to the people. That's Ruth. There is some agency for God in Aleppo because of Bashara and people like Bashara. You can almost see the spikes being pulled out of the crucified, silenced God by Ruth and by Bashara. This is a guy named Hadi, who has a PhD in Old Testament and a postdoc in Old Testament, who's courted for academic jobs in Beirut and throughout Europe. Is the new Hebrew scholar here? You're lucky he didn't apply. Amazingly qualified scholar. He's chosen to stay in a small to mid-sized Presbyterian church in the north of Lebanon on the Syrian border to minister to the refugee camps that I just showed you. He should be called Ruth. This is Ani, who is well past retirement age and is a pharmacist, and who goes to work 15, 16 hours every day in a housing development and social action center in Lorsham Wood, the place I showed you with the urban refugees, taking care of refugees day after day. She should be called Ruth. And then maybe the most poignant Ruth that I met was when I came back here. And I went to the McGinnis room at Daye for a Muslim fundraiser to welcome refugees. And a man named Imam Abdul Qadir, who was visiting Imam at the Ummah Mosque, stood up. After speeches, I had the privilege of being asked to give a speech. Jennifer Watts gave a speech. Some politicians gave a speech. And this Imam stood up in the McGinnis room, filled with members of the Muslim community, and in 20 minutes raised $240,000 to bring 8 families, which is great. But at one point, he saw the hands go up and he points to this family down at the back and he says, they're too humble to tell you their story, so I'm going to tell it to you. They're refugees. They're Palestinians. They came to Canada with nothing. And they've been here for a while, struggling, and they've managed to save $60,000. It's the life savings of the family. And this afternoon they split it in two and gave me $30,000 so I could bring the family. They should all be called Ruth. Now, to hear those stories, we talk about truth. Are there truth claims in those narratives I just shared with you? Is the divine being given voice in testimony to the actions of those people? The Anis and the Hadis and the Basharas and the Palestinian family? And the countless others I met in the Middle East risking health and physical safety and giving away their careers and their money to serve. So I want to bend to closure on this by suggesting how we counter this. And we do it in the same way that Ruth did. But here, if you'll count those 30 seconds of analysis, I want to talk about Walter Brueggemann. Walter Brueggemann says, even in the seemingly well-off and peaceful West, the largest characteristic of society is violence. We mostly don't live in the midst of that violence. We live in a culture made safe and wealthy because the violence is out there somewhere being done on our behalf to make us safe and wealthy. And the violence largely comes in the form of material deprivation, in the breakdown of connections. Anybody attend any of the TRC hearings? We're talking, sir? You want to talk about breakdowns of connections that enabled a capitalist market economy to thrive on this land? Huh? And in silence. We complain about being slowly silenced like the frog in the kettle by post-Christendom. Go into a Mi'kmaq community and learn about silencing. Go to North Preston and learn about silencing. And the last thing I say about Brueggemann is, he says, God, the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, is irascible. You can't nail this God down with an assertion, with a propositional imposition of truth. That speech about God needs to be polyvalent. It comes from many voices, in many ways, in many languages, and in many times. And when all of those are put together, you get a picture of this irascible God that will not be held and contained by linear, sequential, analytical, instrumental thinking, which our culture says is the only real kind of thinking. What's happened in the last few decades? The disappearance of Jungian or Freudian psychoanalysis as a respected pursuit. Why? Because it's not linear, analytical, instrumentalist, sequential thinking. It's polyvalent, and the truth is irascible. I'll tell you where I learned that our society is held together by violence, that we may not be empire like the US, but we're at least empire-like. Can you guess where this picture was taken? Bird Church. I was one of the observer group that went to Bird Church in 2000. Look at all the hair I had back then. Wrong way. We went out on the boats, we saw the violence, we videotaped the violence, we sent the violence to the CBC re-edited the violence and put it on the TV so that it looked like it was initiated by the Mi'kmaq, not by the police. Before the police did this, rammed their boats and beat them. We met people who had just been in a police station and who had scars on their throat because Mounties had slammed them against the wall and they were never charged. We heard stories from children that they said, we can't tell your parents because their parents will turn to violence, of walking along the beach and having the bullets dance like skipping rocks off the water onto the beach, fired by non-Aboriginal fishers, none of whom were ever charged. As a matter of fact, after the first summer of violence by non-Aboriginal fishers against the Mi'kmaq, who were trying to assert their fishing rights based on the Marshall decision, what was the response? Dozens of them were deputized as DFO officers and given steel-hauled boats the next year. Now, I'm not saying there was no violence carried out by First Nations people, or that there was that they were entirely righteous in all their actions. What I'm saying is, we there saw the scab pulled off and the rise of a violent society when it needs to be. And the first victim of the violence was truth. I went on the April march. Remember they stopped the gun violence march in April after all those shootings in the Prestons and in the West End? I used to go on these marches all the time. I somehow they went off my radar. My boys were going on this one, so I went on the march. My boys, we started at the back, they walked fast, so we walked almost the full length of the march. I have to say, I was stunned at how few people I recognized. How few people from our faith communities were walking with them. And I felt ashamed about how long it had been since I had walked with them. This is the Don't Be Afraid choir, started by Scott Jones after he was stabbed for being gay in New Glasgow, the first event held at St. Matthew's Church. And what happened on that night, I wasn't there, you were there, right, Neil? Is that a GLTB person would get up and testify, and then would be sung to. And then there was this liturgy of singing alternating testimony, which was prophetic and pastoral in viewing. Anybody recognize the Bentwood box from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? We know what happened there. The truth-telling and the deep listening. Well, a couple of years ago I went to something called the Kinsler Institute, led by Elaine Enns and Ched Myers in California. It was before I started to go to the Middle East. When I went there and stepped into this justice-seeking community that does watershed justice in California, I was asked to speak towards the end of the time. And I found myself confessing creeping apostasy. Intermittent apostasy. See, when I came to St. Andrews to serve this privileged congregation in South End of Halifax, I was just full of piss and vinegar and right out of the third world and ready to give testimony. And then, not long afterwards, I was asked to be co-chair of the United Church Committee that worked with the TRC. And I was in talking circle after talking circle after talking circle. And I was absorbing testimony and stories of those who give what Brueggemann calls the subversion. There's a dominant version of what's happening in our culture, the meta-narrative of North American democracy, and then there's the subversion told on the protest marches and the Vox Choir events and at the TRC. And I've been immersed in the subversion consistently. And I was giving testimony out of that. And I was telling real gritty stories. And in some ways I was able to embody in my speech the polyvalent voices that witness to the irascible God. And then my time on the task group ended, and for 2 or 3 years, I was only hanging around with privileged, mostly white, middle-class Haligonians who live in the protected bubble, created and protected by the violence out there, and I slipped into a kind of truth-telling and speaking that had nothing of the prophetic in it. Well, Susan's saying, give me a break, with less of the prophetic and less effective prophetic. It's apostasy. And it's the biggest reason why we're being silenced. And it's the biggest reason why Christendom existed in the first place. And it's the place we have to get out of if we're ever going to have the power and the credibility and the genius to make truth claims and post everything well. And how do we make them? We go on the protest march. We gather at Parade Square afterwards. We sit through the hour of long speeches by African Nova Scotians. Some of them articulate, some of them inarticulate. We absorb the testimony and we just go out and give a voice to the testimony. And we tell the story. And we're truth-telling and giving God agency at least as much in the listening as in the going out and telling. Sitting there and listening, and be seen sitting there and listening. Linda Yates has finally convinced me I need to start wearing a collar so that I can be seen as a Christian sitting and listening. It's a truth claim. And then the testimony is a truth claim. You invite Vox to replicate their liturgy in your church on Sunday morning, or wherever it is you gather. And let them make the truth claims on your behalf. And you sit there as Christians and say, this is whom we chose to host and give voice to. There's our truth claim. And you don't forget about the first peoples of this land in the talking circles and the walking with, just because the TRC is over. And I can tell you, if you sit and listen deeply, and you go to those places, you will, like Ruth, bring philios, agape, and eros alive. Eros in a deeper sense than sexual, physical love. At the deepest level of listening, the distance between you and me, Lynn, is disappearing. And for a moment, I'm becoming you, and you're becoming me, and this exchange of spirit is of a whole kind of eros that our culture doesn't recognize, and we are transformed. And then we just get up and go back to the places where people are ready to listen to us, and we give testimony, and we tell stories, and we carry the smell of the places where we have been. And we don't worry about propositional assertions and doctrines, at least not the first. And we trust that, like Ruth, we are giving God voice and agency. And the spikes are being pulled from God's arms. May it be so.
We have time for a handful of questions. Questions, comments, thoughts? Maureen.
I don't really have a question, but I have a comment. Someone who's lived in the subculture of our society, I have found church very difficult. And I've been invited to go to a brief share within a Wesleyan church. And it's been very painful because all they do is try to convert me to be a Christian rather than deal with grief. So they're not able to completely listen, and I think that in plain language, we all need to be seen, heard, and treated like we matter.
Thank you.
I wonder if you'd like to make a comment about evangelism and the place in context of what you're talking about here.
So, I think evangelism has two components. Three, actually. Invitation, hospitality, and witness. I think that we sometimes get it wrong by making invitation the first part. And I think that the faith communities to which we're inviting people need to smell like the places I just described and carry the stories and offer polyvalent voices and be ready to offer hospitality to those who've been marked and scarred by the dominant version and who carry the subversion within them. And then I think once that's true of our communities, invitation will be received. And a lot of people who want to live civic religion in our culture will come and get a smell of us and move on. But others who carry scars and hurts and have been forced to live this underbelly of the dominant version will find home. And then what happens, I think, is that communities grow a certain power and a dynamism in which there is a kind of virtuous cycle of invitation. I think the story we just heard is the exact opposite of that, and is so often the norm when it comes to evangelism. So we think that evangelism is an invitation to come to a place and receive the truth like it's in a box, and we open it up and give it to them. And it's invitation to come and to be immersed into this cacophony of polyvalent voices and add a voice to the array. And you and I work together a lot, and I think in our experience, you can tell me whether you think it's true or not, is that we've walked up to that line and put our toes over it and retreated, and walked up to that line and put our toes over it and retreated it multiple times. And sometimes we actually stepped over and lived the other. And then other things, fear, narrative of scarcity, has sent us back over the line. How's that work?
I was thinking about the art installation that's gone viral the last few days from not the reenactment of the song, but the visual of the number of soldiers killed on the first day of the song, and thinking there is like you're forever changed when you can kind of get to that real truth in human cost. And how we do that, and how we do that without burning out.
Yeah. So this thing about not burning out is really, really, really important. us know and have had a moment where we've really stepped into the sub-narrative. And it's been alive in us. And most of us who work for mainline churches work inside a shell game, where sub-narratives exposed, dominant narratives exposed, sub-narratives exposed, and then the annual report comes, and they tell you, and they quantify success or failure, right? Or sub-narratives exposed, and somebody who contributes a lot of money gets pissed off and leaves. And I think burnout is so often not just a product of the number of hours and compassion fatigue. Those things are true. But it's the inner pre-conscious tension of living half in the dominant narrative and half in the sub-narrative all the frigging time.
And wanting to be in both, quite frankly, for me. It's really nice to be in that dominant narrative much of the time.
It is. I had a mentor, a guy named Bill Coffin, who had the capacity to move within the dominant narrative and never let it inside him. And if I could do a DNA transfer from Bill to me and adopt one of his characteristics, that would be it. Oh, sorry. Here and then Helen, then. But I forgot one thing I was going to say to you then. Which is, so I think what we need, and you made reference to this, is communities. We need to get out of the half community, the half sub-narrative community sometimes, and just gather in communities where the sub-narrative is allowed to be fully alive, and be there with all our warts and doubts and all, and then go back to the community, which is in this ambivalent relationship between the two. And we have not done a good job. We kind of do it at Berwick for 9 or 10 days a year. The Kinsler Institutes with Chet Myers and Elaine Inns do it. When you spend time in Aboriginal communities, you can get it. But we have not done a good job of building community. And one of the recent graduates of AST, John Ray, has done a really interesting thing. He just went and bought a farm. I don't know how you, like 2 years into ministry, buy a farm. He married well. He married someone who's both a physician and deeply attached to the sub-narrative and community. And they're just going to do it. And I think that's going to be their primary ministry, is set up a community. What's your name?
Roxanne.
Okay, Roxanne.
So for the past 2 weeks, I need your help with this. For the past 2 weeks, I've been calling all the local churches, asking the question, where do the homeless people worship? Not one person has been willing to return my phone call, and I think I've been very nice and very polite. And I've called several times, and I'm not getting any response whatsoever. And I have worshipped in a cathedral where homeless people were members of our congregation. They came to Bible study, and when we took communion, we all drank out of the same silver chalice. And I think it was the most profound and significant worship experience I've ever had. Because every Sunday when I went to church, I was confronted with this. And I cannot get any response from the community regarding this question. So what do you do?
Well, I can't tell you what you should do. I'll tell you something that Susan and I and some others have been trying to do. So I'll just tell a story. I arrived in St. Andrews 11 years ago. You arrived, about 7 years ago? And there were 2 faith communities meeting there every Sunday. Sunday morning, a pretty privileged community that does well in the dominant version, but really had their ears open and their hearts open to the subversion and to being moved by it. And then on Sunday evenings, 250 poor and homeless people who gather for a free meal in the hall. And there's a liturgy to that free meal. And there's community, and there's the own form of worship. And then afterwards, there's a worship service a percentage of people stay for, and it's more evangelical and theologically different than what happens on Sunday mornings. A number of us have been trying to reach through time and go put them together. Now, the first strategy was dropping time for cookies and coffee and tea and card playing and storytelling during the afternoons, where members of the morning community host members of the evening community and get to know their stories. And there are people here that I'm proud of who've been deeply embedded in that effort of bringing them together and who've offered hospitality and who sit and listen. It's hard work. Pulling in this direction from the morning towards the evening, I think, is harder than the pulling from the evening to the morning. But we work at it. Now, the next vision, if anybody here wants to be involved, this is not evangelism, it's an invitation. We're hoping that we get a meal in between the morning worship and the drop-in every Sunday. We're hoping just to launch this in the fall, to which everybody's welcome. And maybe we start with fellowship on the table. I have to tell you though, it's hard work.
Thank you, Russ. As always, you make my brain think first. You make me think so much. Thank you. My question is, I don't think you include post-imperialism in your list, did you? Did I miss that?
Now you could put post-colonialism and post-imperialism in there too. Although I think the way I describe Christendom, post-Christianity really resonates with post-imperialism.
I was thinking of post-imperialism in relation to the recent Brexit.
Mm.
So one of the things that has really disturbed me is the post-Brexit activities of people meeting others in the street and saying, get your passport and go home. Naomi, when she was welcome home, but Ruth wasn't told to get her passport and go home. I'm concerned about this reaction in Britain.
Yeah.
Would you comment on that?
There's a brilliant moment at the end of the movie The Big Short, where they lie. They say, and all of the people whose actions led to the financial collapse in 2008 were put in jail. And the economy was restructured. And then they flip and they say, no, what really happened was a scapegoat of marginalized people and people of color and the rise of, they didn't call it Trumpism, but that's what it was. And that, I think, is a big part of what's happening with Brexit and post-Brexit, which is that the people who are being pushed into the underbelly of the dominant version are so often seduced into scapegoating as opposed to giving voice to the subversion and challenging and critiquing the dominant version. You know, I saw this so much when I came to understand the Afrikaner community in South Africa. People just want to know that somebody is below them, right? And the middle class in Britain and the United States, and to a certain extent in Canada, is falling into the underbelly. In the United States now, there are more people who qualify as lower class than middle class. Shocking statistic. And you can drive along the interstates and visit cities all the way over here to California and not know it, right? And so one of the kinds of truth-telling that I think is really necessary, and it only can happen, is if we are embedded within people who can speak the subversion, is to help that turn towards a critique of the dominant version as opposed to scapegoating. And scapegoating is the brilliant escape valve, pressure release valve that maintains the dominant version, right? And Trump is the valve right now. David, what's wrong? You don't do these things without asking a question. Have I silenced you?
Oh my God.
Apparently not.
I don't believe the turn of the punch bowl necessarily.
Put the mic in your mouth, please.
Okay. It's a book by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. It's called Halachic Man. Now, it probably needs to be updated on it. It's a generic man for this. And Rabbi Soloveitchik was an Orthodox rabbi, taught at Yeshiva University for 20 years, very distinguished rabbinical family. He's very much aware of existential philosophy in Germany. And he says, you look around the world, you see, you know something, everything you said is absolutely true here. There's horror here, there's all this deconstructing, the world falling apart here. Yes, the world is this area every time around this. But you know something? That's why we need halacha, the Jewish legal structure for that. He uses terms like a priori. Just as there are scientific, logical a prioris, the halachic man, the Jewish man or woman, who comes to a situation, comes with a whole set of guidelines that are always there and they do not come out of date. And so, even if you're in the middle of Auschwitz, you can still say the Shema. You can say, oh, it says there, do not stand by the blood of your brother. You have a whole series of things to go there. The story of Ruth only works because they come to the land and there are halachas, go back, there's about a dozen laws which are taking place there, which makes the story effective and work with that. A priori, laws of the corner of the field, laws of redeeming the property of the theft, laws of showing kindness to the motherless. And so, this is where I would come when I see these things. I don't know if that's relevant or not, just a comment which coming from where I would come about that. Yes, the world is an awful, ungodly place, always going to be at that, but a certain type of Jew can come and they're never going to be lost. They'll always come, there'll always something in the halachic tradition, the whole Jewish tradition to say to that there, because they come with an a priori to that. Some extent or not.
Yeah. So let me follow on what you're saying, because I think one of the great challenges in our world today is that we have, how do you pronounce it? Halacha. We have Sharia. We have UN Declaration on Human Rights. We have now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We have the American Constitution, the Canadian Constitution and Bill of Rights, and these are all necessary for the running of societies. Except, what's happening is all of these societies are being hurled into each other. And if we start whacking each other with our laws and say, you must live by this law, Sharia, or you're an apostate and I've got to kill you, there's a problem. And we should recognize that in the West, we take the UN Declaration on Human Rights and its individualism and whack lots of people who prioritize group rights over individual rights over the head. What I would say is, even in talking about the laws, we need deep dialogue and listening, polyvalent voices, and maybe we don't talk about the irascible God or irascible wisdom. And we have to go to a depth of listening so that it becomes what I just described as erotic. And then maybe a network of legal systems that work for the whole planet start to arise out of that dialogue. But remember, the truth-telling is not going to be propositional assertions based on meta-narratives or meta-legal systems. Right? It's going to happen in relation to those things.
What I would like to see from my point of view is the command coming out of all of that. If there's not a command coming out of all that, then there's something's been missed there.
Wouldn't it be great if we could agree on a few simple commandments as a species? Thou shalt not kill. Right? Wouldn't it be great if we could find a handful where we could start? But I don't think we're ever going to get to that place until we listen to each other into the confidence. This is what Jody was talking about at the beginning. You know, I've been in a lot of talking circles, and one of the things I realized is that once everybody in the circle is listening to each other with full body, heart, and it's tribal, because the full body is involved in this. wisdom starts to come up through the middle of the circle that nobody carried into it. It's one of the great gifts that the Aboriginal folks have given us in terms of talking circles, right? I think we only listen to each other into those voices.
Thank you. We do need to stop, unfortunately. A couple of things before we adjourn. There's a reception actually. That was one of the things I wanted to say. So a couple of things. I'm teaching downstairs right now, and Russ is upstairs. It's surprising the building hasn't exploded. So only because we have two incredible classes full of incredible students, incredible scholars, and incredible questions. So one of the adages my students are painfully familiar with is steering to the storm, whether it's an individual pastoral experience or whether it's a parish dealing with difficult piece, a diocese, a conference, a government. Just go to the storm, which is almost counterintuitive. We live in a society that loves to be comfortable, that wants to avoid things, and then if you disturb my world, we will demonize you, we will push you out, we won't steer into the difficult places. And the beautiful thing about steering into difficult places is we don't know what the answer will be. We don't know. We do not know. And that's a beautiful guarantee, but that is the courage of faith. We don't know. But we do know that by steering away from the storm, horrible things happen. And none of this erotic energy that Russ was talking about can ever come into view where we have intimacy and closeness. Tonight, we had an hour and a bit, well, an hour and 40 minutes if we include all the questions, which were provocative and statements. We spent time steering into the storm. If there is a sense of great principle, please live it, that we have to look at those difficult places because there is integrity in that process, in that journey, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And you took us on that extraordinary journey. That's the thank you. I'll hold for one more thing. Every other year we do music. Last year Garth was here. This year preaching. Next year we'll do music. Fred Graham's going to be here. Then following that, we will again go back to preaching. But tonight, the whole time, Russ, as I was listening to you, I was thinking this is a symphony. A discordant one, a rhythmic one, an embodied one. So I want to thank you so much from all of us to you for your wonderful leadership, your imagery, your creativity, your courage, and your willingness to steer into the storms of life.